The royal family have put on a united front to attend an Easter church service.
A holiday meant for joy and unity has suddenly turned into a storm of controversy. Meghan is facing intense backlash after a recent Easter post left many viewers unsettled, sparking debates across social media. At the same time, the royal family's celebrations are drawing praise and admiration, creating a striking contrast that's hard to ignore. As reactions continue to pour in, questions are mounting. What exactly made the post so disturbing? And why is this moment being seen as yet another turning point in an already heated narrative? But what do you think this moment was really trying to say? And what might have been left out? Drop your comment below and subscribe as we uncover the deeper story behind the headlines. The image that didn't feel right. It began quietly, almost too quietly for something that would soon ignite such an intense reaction. On Easter morning, Meghan Markle shared a glimpse into her world from Montecito. At first glance, it appeared soft, calm, even intimate. A child stood in a wide, open space, holding a small toy, surrounded by gentle Easter details, eggs, muted colors, a carefully arranged setting. But something about it felt off. The camera never revealed a full face. Instead, it lingered on the back of young Lilibet's head, offering only a partial view, just enough to suggest presence, but not enough to satisfy curiosity. The framing felt deliberate. The angles were controlled. Every detail appeared chosen, not spontaneous. What was presented as a simple family moment quickly began to draw a very different kind of attention. Almost immediately, critics began to push back. Words like creepy, unnatural, and calculated started to circulate. Not because the content was overtly alarming, but because of what it seemed to be doing beneath the surface. Observers noted how the image gave just enough access to draw people in, while holding something back. It created a sense of distance, even as it invited attention. And that balance between showing and hiding became the center of the controversy. Media analysts and royal commentators pointed to a familiar strategy. This was not the language of private family sharing. It mirrored something else entirely, a technique often used in content creation, where partial reveals are designed to build intrigue. By offering only fragments, the audience is encouraged to look closer, to wonder more, to stay engaged. It is a method built on curiosity, not clarity. That is where the tension began to deepen. Because if this was truly about privacy, why not step away from the camera entirely? Why present a child at all, only to conceal identity so precisely? And if it was about sharing a personal moment, why did it feel so structured, so intentionally framed? The questions did not come from nowhere. They came from the contrast between what was being shown and how it was being shown. For some, it felt like a contradiction, a moment positioned as natural, yet carrying the weight of careful design. A family image that seemed less about connection and more about control. The child was present, but distant, visible, yet hidden. And in that space between visibility and concealment, the conversation shifted. What exactly was this image meant to be? The reaction was not just about a photograph. It was about perception, about intention, about whether what people were seeing was real or something shaped to appear that way. And as the discussion grew louder, one idea began to take hold more strongly than the rest, that this was not simply an Easter post, but a calculated presentation, one that raised uncomfortable questions about where authenticity ends and strategy begins. An image meant to feel gentle instead sparked suspicion, raising a deeper question that refuses to fade. Was this truly a private family moment, or a carefully constructed illusion designed to guide perception, blurring the line between authenticity and strategy in ways few initially recognized? Stay with us. The contradiction that could not be ignored. As the reaction to the Easter post continued to build, the focus began to shift from the image itself to something far more difficult to reconcile. It was no longer just about how the moment looked. It was about what it stood against. Because while Meghan Markle was sharing carefully framed glimpses of her children with millions of followers, Prince Harry had spent years warning the world about the dangers of that very space. His position had been clear and consistent. He had spoken at global forums, joined conversations with experts, and repeatedly described social media as a system that could harm young people. He had called attention to its psychological impact, its addictive design, and its ability to shape behavior in ways that were not always visible but deeply felt. In those moments, his message carried weight. It positioned him as someone trying to protect the next generation from the unseen costs of digital exposure. And yet, here was a moment that seemed to sit directly against that message. The Easter content was not shared in a private circle. It was placed on a public platform, reaching a global audience, becoming part of a broader stream of content designed to hold attention. The partial images, the carefully controlled angles, the decision to reveal just enough without showing everything, all pointed toward a very specific method. It was not accidental. It followed a pattern. Media observers described it as a curiosity gap, a technique where the audience is given fragments instead of the full picture, just enough to create interest, but not enough to close the loop. It invites questions, encourages speculation, and keeps attention fixed on what might come next. It is a strategy widely used in digital storytelling and commercial content, built to sustain engagement over time. This is where the contradiction became harder to dismiss. Supporters argued that there was a difference. They said sharing controlled family moments was not the same as exposing children to the uncontrolled chaos of the internet. They pointed out that parents have always shared pieces of their lives with others, and that this was simply a modern version of that instinct. In isolation, that reasoning held some truth, but critics saw something else entirely. They pointed to the scale of the audience, the structure of the content, and the context in which it was being presented. This was not a private exchange between friends. It was a public-facing channel, followed by millions, where every post carried weight beyond a simple family update. In that space, the children were not just present. They became part of a larger narrative, one that blurred the line between personal life and public image. That is where the tension settled, because the question was no longer whether the content was allowed or even understandable. The question was whether it aligned with the principles that had been so strongly voiced before. And as that gap between message and action became more visible, it began to reshape how the entire moment was being seen, not as an isolated post, but as part of something much bigger that was still unfolding. Tension shifted in an instant, turning a simple post into something far more revealing. When actions begin to contradict powerful public beliefs, what does that expose behind the surface? And is this Easter moment only the beginning of a much larger unraveling story? Stay glued. The moment that defined the day. While the debate surrounding the Montecito post continued to intensify, attention did not remain fixed in one place. It began to shift, almost instinctively, across the Atlantic, where a completely different image was quietly forming. On that same Easter morning in 2026 at Windsor, something unfolded with a level of precision that did not feel forced, yet carried undeniable weight. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, arrived at St. George's Chapel alongside their children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. There was no grand announcement attached to it, no attempt to frame it as anything extraordinary. And yet, the moment spoke with clarity that required no explanation. 5 figures moved together, steady and composed, walking toward a place deeply tied to royal history. Every step carried a sense of continuity, not because it was staged, but because it followed a rhythm that had existed long before them. The children, now growing into their roles, displayed a quiet awareness that stood out. They were not overwhelmed. They were not uncertain. There was a calm understanding in the way they carried themselves, as though they recognized what the moment asked of them without needing to be told. What made the scene striking was not spectacle, but restraint. There was no visible effort to control how it would be perceived, no sign of over-curation. It was simple, almost understated. A family present in full view, connected not just to each other, but to something far larger. That simplicity became its strength. By the following morning, the impact of that image had become unmistakable. It appeared across the front pages of major British newspapers, repeated with remarkable consistency. Different publications, different headlines, yet the same photograph, again and again. It did not compete with other images. It replaced them. It defined the narrative of the day without needing to argue for attention. The message it carried was clear. This was the future of the monarchy. Visible, unified, stable. At a time when questions had surrounded the institution from multiple directions, this single image seemed to offer an answer without speaking. It projected a sense of order that felt grounded rather than constructed. What gave it even more weight was the presence of the children within that frame. They were not partially revealed or carefully obscured. They were fully visible, participating in a tradition that had been passed down through generations. Their role in that moment did not feel like exposure. It felt like preparation, like a gradual introduction into something they would one day carry forward themselves. And that is where the contrast became impossible to overlook. On one side, an image built on fragments, controlled angles, partial glimpses that invited interpretation but withheld certainty. On the other, a complete picture, open, direct, and rooted in something established over time. One asked the audience to look closer, the other gave them something clear to hold on to. As people moved between these two images, the difference became sharper with each passing hour. It was no longer just about which image was more appealing. It was about what each one represented beneath the surface, because this was never simply about visibility. It was about meaning. One image created curiosity, but left space for doubt. The other provided direction, showing exactly where the institution stood and who would guide it forward. And as that contrast settled into public perception, attention did not drift. It anchored itself firmly on Windsor, where the message had already been delivered with quiet confidence, leaving everything else to be measured against it. Visibility was only the surface. One image pulled the world in but left it questioning, while another quietly defined the future with striking certainty. Why did clarity command attention so effortlessly while mystery created unease? And what does that reveal about who truly controls the narrative? Stay tuned. A picture that raised quiet questions. As the image from Windsor continued to settle in the public mind, the earlier post from Montecito began to take on a different weight. What had first been seen as unusual now started to feel more unsettling. The focus returned to the same quiet frame shared by Meghan Markle. But this time, people were looking at it more closely, not for what it showed, but for what it seemed to suggest. The scene itself had not changed. A child stood alone, seen only from behind, holding a small toy in a wide and carefully arranged space. There were no other children nearby, no visible signs of interaction, no sense of movement or shared experience. It was still, almost too still. And that stillness began to stand out in a way that was difficult to ignore. The reaction slowly shifted. It was no longer driven by criticism alone. It moved into something quieter, more reflective. A growing sense of discomfort began to take hold. Because when placed beside the images from Windsor, the difference was not just visual, it was emotional. At Windsor, the children of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were seen stepping into a public setting, surrounded by people, part of a shared moment that connected them to a wider world. They were engaged, present, and clearly part of a structured environment that balanced visibility with purpose. Their presence carried meaning beyond the frame. In Montecito, the atmosphere felt entirely different. The child in the image appeared separate from everything else. The space around her was open, almost distant, with no visible connection to others. The setting, though peaceful, lacked the warmth of interaction. What was meant to reflect freedom and calm began to look more like isolation when viewed through a different lens. This contrast did not need to be explained. It was felt. And with that feeling came a deeper question. What was the image trying to communicate? Was it meant to show a private, protected childhood away from public pressure? Or was it presenting a version of life that did not fully match what people expected to see? The more the image was examined, the harder it became to find a clear answer, because the message seemed to exist somewhere between intention and perception. What may have been designed as a soft and controlled glimpse into family life was now being interpreted in ways that were far less certain. The absence of visible connection, the deliberate framing, the choice to reveal without fully showing, all combined to create a sense that something was missing. Not visibly, but emotionally. And as that feeling continued to grow, the image itself began to shift in meaning, no longer just a moment captured on Easter morning, but a reflection of something more complex that had yet to fully reveal itself. A quiet Easter moment, carefully framed and partially revealed, begins to feel strangely incomplete. Why does an image designed to comfort leave behind a sense of distance and unease? And as new footage surfaces, is this a glimpse of reality or something more deliberately constructed? Keep watching. The footage that complicated the story. Just as the questions around the Easter image began to settle into something deeper, another piece of content surfaced, adding a new layer to the unfolding narrative. This time, it was not a still image, but a video. Prince Harry was seen skiing with his son Archie, moving across snowy slopes in what appeared to be a relaxed and joyful moment. On the surface, it seemed simple. A father and son share time together during a holiday, a continuation of the same Easter theme that had already been introduced. But as with the earlier post, the details did not sit as easily as they first appeared. The video suggested a family trip, a shared experience, something warm and complete. Yet, almost immediately, another image began to circulate. A photograph taken during the same period showed Harry on the slopes again, but this time alongside Princess Eugenie. The setting matched. The timing aligned. But the composition told a different story. There was no sign of Meghan in that frame. That absence did not go unnoticed. It introduced a quiet but persistent question. If the skiing footage was meant to present a family holiday, then where exactly did each part of that story fit? Was everything happening at the same time, or were separate moments being brought together to create a single narrative? The more closely people looked, the harder it became to place each piece with certainty. Observers began to point out that this was not the first time such questions had surfaced. There had been moments in the past where what was presented publicly did not fully match what could be independently seen or confirmed. The gap between appearance and reality had been noted before, and now, once again, that gap seemed to be opening. The skiing video itself was not unusual. Parents share moments like this all the time. But in this context, it was no longer being viewed in isolation. It was part of a wider pattern that had already drawn attention. A pattern where images and clips seemed carefully selected, arranged, and released in a way that shaped perception rather than simply reflecting it. That is where the unease began to deepen. Because if the Easter post had raised questions about intention, this new footage began to raise questions about consistency. The pieces did not fully connect. The timeline was not entirely clear. And the absence of certain elements, especially Meghan's presence, added to the uncertainty rather than resolving it. What emerged was not a clear contradiction, but something more subtle, a sense that what was being shown might not be the full picture. Those moments were being presented in a way that created a certain feeling, even if the underlying reality was more complex. And as these layers continued to build, the narrative moved further away from a simple holiday story. and closer to something far more intricate, where each new detail did not close the gap, but widened it just enough to keep the questions alive. Something didn't quite align, and the more it was observed, the more the gap seemed to grow rather than close. Was this carefully shaped reality, or a deeper story slipping through the cracks, quietly revealing a divide no one was meant to fully see? Let's find out. The silent divide behind the palace walls. As questions around the Sussex narrative continued to build, attention began to shift once again, this time toward something far less visible, but far more consequential. Behind the polished images of Easter Sunday at Windsor, another story was unfolding. It was not captured in a single photograph. It did not appear in one moment, but its presence could be felt in what was missing. The absence of certain familiar faces stood out almost immediately. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, along with the wider York family, were not present at the Easter service at St. George's Chapel in 2026. This was not a minor detail. In previous years, they had been part of such gatherings. Their absence created a noticeable gap, one that invited quiet speculation. At the center of that shift were two very different approaches to leadership. King Charles III, now carrying the weight of the crown, had long been known for his instinct toward family unity. His approach often leaned toward inclusion, toward maintaining personal bonds even in difficult circumstances. For him, relationships carried history, and history carried meaning. But standing alongside that perspective was another, sharper and more defined. Prince William had begun to shape a different vision, one that placed the institution itself at the center, above individual connections. His focus appeared clear: protect the long-term image of the monarchy, even if that meant making decisions that felt difficult on a personal level. The absence of the York family at Easter began to look less like coincidence and more like the result of that tension. For William, the association between the York family and ongoing controversies surrounding Prince Andrew carried reputational risks that could not be ignored. From his perspective, maintaining a clean and focused public image for the monarchy required firm boundaries. It was not about personal judgment. It was about institutional survival. For Charles, the situation appeared more complex. Beatrice and Eugenie were not defined solely by their father's actions. They had built their own lives, their own families, their own paths. To exclude them entirely risked creating a different kind of imbalance, one that could fracture the sense of family that he had spent years trying to preserve. This difference in approach did not need to be spoken aloud. It revealed itself through decisions, through attendance, through who appeared and who did not. And that is what gave the Windsor image its deeper strength. Because while the Sussex narrative raised questions about presentation and consistency, the scene at Windsor offered something else entirely. It showed clarity. A smaller, more focused group, standing together without uncertainty. Every person in that frame had a defined role. Every presence felt intentional. It was not just a family walking toward a chapel. It was a message about direction. And as the gap between these two approaches continued to widen beneath the surface, the carefully composed image of Easter Sunday began to carry more than just tradition. It carried the weight of decisions being made, lines being drawn, and a future that was quietly taking shape, even as the full story remained just out of reach. It looked like a simple walk, but beneath it, something far more decisive was unfolding. One image projected certainty, the other raised questions. As quiet decisions reshape the future, is this where the balance of power finally shifts beyond recovery? Let's unravel the truth. When the message starts to lose its power. As the deeper tensions within the royal structure continued to take shape, the focus gradually returned to Montecito, where another question had begun to surface. It was no longer just about what was being posted. It was about how those posts were being received, and whether they were achieving what they were intended to do. When Meghan Markle returned to Instagram, The expectation was clear. It was meant to mark a new phase, a direct connection with a global audience, a platform that could support a broader lifestyle identity while maintaining personal authenticity. The anticipation around that return carried weight. Many expected strong engagement, steady growth, and a clear narrative that would bring everything together. But the response told a more complicated story. Despite having millions of followers, the level of interaction did not match the scale of the audience. The numbers did not reflect the kind of momentum that would typically support a growing brand presence. Engagement appeared uneven. Some posts drew attention, while others seemed to pass with limited impact. The consistency that builds trust over time was not fully there. Part of that difficulty appeared to come from the content itself. At times, the account felt personal. Quiet moments, family glimpses, carefully framed scenes that suggested intimacy. At other times, it shifted into something more structured, more aligned with branding and promotion. That movement between two identities created uncertainty. It was not always clear whether the audience was being invited into a private space or being presented with a curated message designed to maintain visibility. That lack of clarity began to affect how the content was interpreted. The Easter post, with its partial reveal and controlled framing, became a defining example of that confusion. It was positioned as a simple family moment, yet carried the tone of something more deliberate. The skiing footage followed a similar pattern, presented as a natural holiday experience, but raising questions about timing, presence, and continuity. Each piece on its own might have been easily accepted. Together, they formed a pattern that was harder to overlook, and that pattern shaped perception. Because while the Sussex content continued to invite questions, the image from Windsor remained steady and clear. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, alongside their children, had already delivered a message that required no explanation. It was simple. It was direct. It showed unity, structure, and a defined sense of purpose. There was no ambiguity in that image. That is where the difference became most visible. One narrative asked the audience to interpret, to question, to fill in gaps. The other presented a complete picture, leaving little room for doubt. And in a space where public attention moves quickly and decisions are made in moments, clarity carries power. What began as a comparison between two Easter images had grown into something larger, a reflection of two very different approaches to communication, to visibility, and to control. One built on suggestion and partial access, the other grounded in openness and consistency. And as those two approaches continued to unfold side by side, the balance between them appeared to be shifting in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to reverse. So what do you think this Easter really revealed? Was Meghan's post a calculated move gone wrong, or proof the royal family has already won the narrative? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.